We are looking at how much change there was in the civilian experience of warfare between 1700 and 1900. Now, no wars were fought in Britain between these years, so civilians did not have to deal directly with the impact of any fighting. Bearing in mind, of course, that they had during the English Civil War of the 1640s. So overall, we'll be looking at the idea that there wasn't a huge amount of change during this period, but of course there are some changes, mostly to do with the increased information that the public received about foreign wars due to advances in communications, really, during this 200-year period. The first one we're going to look at is recruitment and conscription. Civilians continued to become recruits for armies, and it is estimated that, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo was part of that, it is estimated that about 10% of the population fought at some point during those wars, and the death toll during those wars amounted to over 2% of the population. You also see women being recruited for service abroad during this period, mostly as nurses in the medical profession. Your two precise examples there are, of course, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, who became famous during the Crimean War. An additional modest change during this period is to do with the requisitioning of food and the provision of accommodation to troops becoming less of a requirement. And this is mostly because troops were increasingly during this period accommodated in purpose-built barracks to look after them. So during the Napoleonic Wars, you got a huge increase in troops being moved into these new barracks that had been built. For example, another precise figure, by 1812, so just to the eve of the Battle of Waterloo, there were 168 barracks accommodating about 133,000 soldiers during this period. That doesn't mean to say that billeting did not continue as it had done for many centuries in inns and towns, with civilians often complaining of soldiers' poor behaviour, of them getting drunk and fighting on the streets. Now, I've already mentioned before during the English Civil War that taxes were becoming increasingly used by governments to fund wars. This was certainly the case. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, at Waterloo, of course, taxes were used to fund that war. There was a tax on income in that period. A tax at a rate of 10% on all incomes over £200. Lower incomes were also taxed, but at lower rates than that. Obviously, these were very, very unpopular, and no further income taxes were imposed after the Napoleonic Wars for quite a while because of the unpopularity of them, and of course the war had ended. Income tax was reintroduced eventually during the Crimean War. The rates got very high. However, it was only really imposed as a tax on those with quite a high income, so relatively few people actually were qualified to pay that tax during the 1840s and 1850s. War reporting saw quite a significant change, really. If you go back to Waterloo in 1815, it took about 3 days for the news of the Battle of Waterloo to reach England. So it was carried by a messenger on horseback and then by ship. By the time you get to the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, you have had the invention of the electric telegraph, which enabled much faster communication. But having said that, the article on the charge of the Light Brigade, which was written by William Howard Russell for the Times newspaper, did not appear in the newspaper until 20 days after the actual charge of the Light Brigade. So there is still a bit of a delay in the public getting the news of sort of events, even though obviously Crimea is a long, long way away at that time. Having said that, Russell's criticisms of the way the Crimean War was mismanaged did get to the notice of the public and caused a lot of anger and a pressure for reform. But having said that again, you need to remember that newspapers weren't widely read at the time, mostly because about 30–40% of the population were illiterate in the 1850s. And also, the impact of public opinion anyway on politics was minor because only a fraction of the population was eligible to vote. By the time you get to the 1880s, 40% of adult males, and all women, of course, were still unable to vote in elections. It's also important to remember that education and the media tended to emphasise the glory and the patriotism of serving in the British Army. It was a key source of national pride, and therefore they were reluctant to be critical of it. And finally, photography. The Crimean War of the 1850s was the first war that was actually photographed. However, there were technological limitations at the time. You could only have cameras that took photos of static scenes, so there were no action shots. So most photographs tended to be posed portraits of soldiers, maybe in studios or standing beside guns. And of course they tended to be safe and reassuring in subjects, so there were no images of dead and wounded British soldiers, for example, that would upset morale or would be seen as negative in any way. Most newspapers actually continued to use war artists rather than photographs right up till the end of this period, because obviously with that you could inject a bit of patriotism and action into the pictures, which perhaps you couldn't with photographs. By, of course, the time we reached 1900, technology has moved on a little bit, and you could do action shots, you could capture those on camera, and you could even start to shoot very basic silent movies, moving film footage with the new technology that was at your disposal. So overall, you can see that there was some change in the civilian experience of warfare between 1700 and 1900. It tended to involve war reporting, information, some news and some viewpoints of war coming through and affecting social attitudes in a limited way, and an increasing use of photography with limitations in war reporting too.